Okay, so welcome to part 7 of the Brainwashing and Rail Worker Death Investigation Reports by the Transportation Safety Board and critical information that the Transportation Safety Board leaves out of its reports. And again, it can be argued that Transport Canada and the rail carrier, which both signed off on the death investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee as far as the accuracy of that report in order to further rail safety. Well, if they signed off on this report, they too are leaving critical information out of these, reports that are generated for rail worker families, and I mean all families, rail carrier, rail workers, as far as on the front lines, and their families, but also rail customers, rail investors, and the public at large, because all of us as rail families are impacted by what is being revealed here. Okay, so just to recap from what we saw in part 6, we were provided with this figure of what the accident scene looked like. And again, we were told that there was a track switch 23, 22, and 21, when in actuality, the conductor, who was the supervising conductor the day Jason was killed, in his witness statement had referred to these as track switch 12, track switch 13, and track switch 15. And as the supervising conductor on the ground, the person who had more experience and was familiar with the territory, he would have been the one most familiar with what the switches not only actually showed, which was TS23, TS22, or TS21, but he would have been familiar with the documentation tied to that work location, specifically any work instructions that were used for any work that had to be done at that location, and with the operations manuals, which would have the maps tied to this particular work location. And again, the question was, why were the supervising conductor, and we'll see also the locomotive engineer that was new to the territory, and the pilot locomotive engineer, all referring to TS23, not as TS23, but as TS15 in their witness statements. So that's where we left off. We looked at the conductor witness statements, information, and again, remember, the Transportation Safety Board also had that report also had a section on situational awareness, and how the conductor trainee wasn't situationally aware when he was likely killed. Again, how would improper or outdated information as far as what's in the operations manual, what is in potentially your work instructions for the day, or your job briefing, or how your coworkers are even themselves referring to the track switch. If the track switch is labeled TS23, but it's really referred to as TS15 or TS13 or TS12, how would that, whether or not verbally or in writing, how would those issues impact your situational awareness as a conductor trainee working alone in the dark when you are also new to that territory? So things to keep in mind as we go forward, and now look at the locomotive engineer and the pilot locomotive engineer witness statements. Okay, now we're going to get into the locomotive engineer interview, which is 8 pages long. And this locomotive engineer was not the pilot locomotive engineer. This locomotive engineer was new to the territory. So note here that the interview happened on November 19th, which was again the day after Jason was killed. And you can see here on page 2 that a guy who is new to the territory is again referencing TS15. Why is that? This locomotive engineer is new to the territory. Why isn't he referencing the switch as TS-23 per what the switch is actually labeled. Where is he getting this TS-15 as a locomotive engineer who is new to the territory? A locomotive engineer who is new to the territory would have an operations manual at the time, which was paper, and so that could have been where he got the outdated information, or he could have got the outdated information in the work instructions for that day, which might have pulled the wrong switch numbers because the systems hadn't updated or whatever. But where is a locomotive engineer who is new to the territory being familiarized that day? Where is he getting TS-15? The other issue that you may have here is that given the three witnesses had their witness statements all taken the day after Jason was killed, they may have also been comparing notes and deciding to agree that we're all going to talk about TS-15 because that's what's in the work instructions and the manuals, and they didn't refer to TS-23. Why is it that they're all referring to TS-15? That is a huge issue. Why was CN training new employees to the territory with what could have been materials potentially outdated and potentially outdated for years? And why would those providing the training, the supervising conductor, and the pilot locomotive engineer who had tons of experience working in this area and who was familiarizing this particular locomotive engineer, why would you be training employees new to the area with outdated materials instead of training them based on the actual switch numbers at that work location? Huge safety critical issue as far as violations of the labor code potentially and of other health and safety, laws as far as what needs to be done for safety critical tasks and providing accurate documentation, work instructions, etc. Okay, so again, on the locomotive engineer, for the engineer who was new to the territory and was being familiarized that day, you can see on page 3 again that he discusses TS-15. And then the next page is page 8. So between pages 4 and 7, there's no references to a track switch number, so I just left those out. But if you recall, at the beginning of the Transportation Safety Board report, we were also told that Jason died on the way to the hospital in the ambulance. He succumbed to his wounds. Well, if you look at this, on the locomotive engineer witness statement, page 8, it says, did, and then this would be the name of someone, report anything further to you at the scene. So clearly he was still there. And then it says just that Jason had passed away. Well, that to me seems to indicate that Jason died at the scene of the accident. And so given this guy was the new guy, I believe it was the pilot engineer who had run to the site, to the actual location where Jason had been injured. And then he told this particular engineer to call the EMS services, emergency services. And so this particular locomotive engineer was not the one tending to Jason. He was the one who went to call for help. And so I'm thinking that this question here is, did so-and-so report anything further to you at the scene? That's probably the name of the pilot locomotive engineer that was blacked out there. But here's the issue. If Jason indeed died at the scene, as this would seem to imply, why would the Transportation Safety Board tell us at the beginning of their report that Jason succumbed to his wounds, his injuries, on the way to the hospital in the ambulance? Well, are we being lied to? Because I kind of suspect we are, because if I recall in another report, it seemed that there was mention that the body had been removed prior to someone else arriving at the scene. So I'll have to find that in another video. But anyways, the issue is If Jason had died in the ambulance, then maybe CN could argue, well, maybe the ambulance people did something wrong and that's why he really died. If Jason died at the accident location, then there's no blame at all that could ever be put on the emergency services crew. The blame could only be put on CN Rail. And so again, you have to ask yourself, why are we getting these inconsistencies as far as what we're told versus actual witness statements, etc.? Before we leave the witness statement for the locomotive engineer who was new to the territory, there's a point I wanted to emphasize to people. As far as TS15 and versus what's on the actual switch, the TS23, if that switch looked anything like TS22 and there's a picture of that switch in the accident report, I blocked it out for copyright issues potentially. But if you go to the actual accident report, you can see what the picture of the switch looks like and the labeling on that switch. And it's basically the label is painted red and it seems to have a 22 painted in black for the picture that they provide. So if the other switch was anything similar, it would have been painted red with a 23 on it. So here's the issue. I asked my child, who's a locomotive engineer now, and I said, how hard is it to see the actual switch number when you're going by? Well, first of all, you have the issue of, are you the locomotive engineer are you on the proper side of the track? Where are you seated in the locomotive unit? Are you even able to see the switch? Are you on the right side to see the switch? Then there's the issue of the light being bright for the locomotive at night, that when you're coming into a work location, that light is so bright that it basically blanks out the switch number. So unless you're going about 2 miles an hour, you may not even be able to see that switch number. But again, a locomotive engineer would be less familiar with the actual switch numbers on the ground. They'd be familiar with the materials that they have as far as their operations manuals and their work instructions for the day. But the conductors are the ones who work on the ground, who walk by the switches. So if anybody would notice the switch number TS23, it would be the supervising conductor who was, he had worked there before and was familiar with the territory, whereas Jason was not familiar with the territory. So that's just the point I wanted to make, that it might have been very hard for even the locomotive engineers in the unit to actually see the switch numbers, whereas they would be familiar with their training manuals and their work instructions, which is probably where they were getting that TS15. Okay, so now we get to the pilot locomotive engineer witness statement. And the pilot locomotive engineer is a person who is experienced, he's familiar with the territory, and he was the one training the locomotive engineer who was new to the territory so that he could familiarize them with that new work location for the other locomotive engineer. And so if you look at the pilot locomotive engineer interview, it is 9 pages long. And again, it is taken on November 19th, 2013, the same day as the other 2 witnesses, the day after Jason was killed. Now, I want you to notice up here, the first question on this page, and I went to page 9 because there's no other references to switches and whatever. This is the guy who had basically ran out of the locomotive when he realized Jason had been hit, and went to, because he was the one most familiar with the territory, it would make sense that he would know where to go to find Jason. And so it says here, did you notice anything about the position of the cars or the switches? He said, no, I just ran. On the way back, did you notice anything on the way back? And he said, I never went back until the ambulance was there. I never left his side. Okay, so, and then he's saying, is there anything that you can add for prevention. And he said, not at this time. And then he said, I think it says the cars were on TS15. And he said, the answer is yes. So again, he is referring to this track and the switch as TS15, not TS23 or track 23. So, and this is the guy who's the most experienced as far as the crew potentially. He's the locomotive engineer and familiar with the territory. But again, he's talking only about TS15. No mention in his witness statement about TS23. Why is that? And again, the locomotive engineers are in the unit. They're not on the ground. So their main information comes from their operations manuals, which at the time would have been paper copies, and from their work instructions for the day. So where's he getting the TS15? Outdated manuals, outdated maps, outdated or work instructions for the day that use outdated switch information? Very likely that was the case. Okay, before we leave the witness statements, for the people that were actually on the scene the day that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, and that would be the supervising conductor and the two locomotive engineers, one of them being a pilot engineer. I want to bring up here something that I noticed in the health and safety officer report. That's a separate 80-page report that was written by Transport Canada's health and safety officer. And again, I obtained this through the access to information process. Now, if you look here on page 30, and again at the bottom, I give you the page number for the reference number for the collation of all the documents that I had been provided via access to information. And this was the first report I was given in that, group of files. So if you look here, and I'm going to be going through this report with people too, because there are a lot of issues with this report too. But anyways, as far as on page 30, if you look here at the second paragraph at the top here, and I cut some of the page off because I wanted to blow this up a little more, but where it says the TS23 switch, then look what they say in brackets, also known as TS15 in common parlance of crews. Okay, here's the issue with this. First of all, that TS15, given the witness statements, there's no way they could completely ignore the TS15. But this report is not a report that was available online. It's a separate report, and I think the only way you can get it is through access to information. And so most people would never see this information, be totally oblivious to it. But anyways, so where they say here, it's known as TS15 in common parlance. That means that this is common talk for the crews to refer to this switch as TS15. Well, there's a lot of huge issues with that, and why I don't believe that to be the case. And that is the fact that, first of all, conductor trainee Jason Clooney was new to the territory, so he would not have known the common parlance in the area as far as a switch being called TS15 when it is actually labeled TS23. And the other issue is that we've got a locomotive engineer who is new to the territory, and he was being familiarized with the territory that day. And so if he is also new to the territory, there's no way that he would have known the common parlance or common way of referring to this switch as TS15. He had to be getting that from outdated work materials or an outdated, potentially an outdated operations manual with outdated maps in it because they were paper copies at the time, or outdated information provided on current work orders. There is no way that anybody can argue that a locomotive engineer who is new to the territory would be referring to a switch in common parlance when he's never really been in that territory as TS15. That makes absolutely no sense as an argument, because for something to be common parlance, that means, well, over long periods of time, we have just referred to this switch as TS15, even though it's labeled TS23. That makes no sense. So the new locomotive engineer that was new to the territory would not have been a party to common parlance in the past. Makes no sense. So why would his witness statement in particular be referring also to TS15? Has to be another reason for this. So again, folks, that just shows how everything seems to be a lie almost in these reports. It is that bad. Okay, so wanted to make that point very clear for everybody. Okay, so the other issue with the common parlance is, why would they even say this in this investigation report? By including that in there, this is another way to protect Transport Canada and the rail carrier, if you think about it, because we're again putting the blame potentially on the crew members rather than putting the blame where it belongs. Because if we're training employees that are new to the territory, or even having old employees using outdated materials, that's a safety critical issue when you're talking about switches and proper switching operations, because you flip a switch the wrong way, and yes, people can get killed, we can have derailments, the issues are massive. And so by saying that, oh, it was just common parlance for the crews to refer to this switch as TS15 when it was actually labeled TS23, that's a way to deflect blame. Again, it's more brainwashing in my humble opinion. Now, earlier I had also discussed the fact that conductor trainee Jason Clooney, in the Transportation Safety Board report, we were told that conductor trainee Jason Clooney succumbed to his injuries in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And again, that was another lie. And here is the undeniable proof of that. If you look at this second arrow here in this report, it says the position of the victim's body was described by the coroner, whom had witnessed it in place prior to its removal. So I have a very good memory, and when I remember reading something, you can be pretty sure I remember it and I'll know where to find it. So this is where I had seen that fact that conductor trainee Jason Clooney had died on the scene. And so there is no way that they could possibly assign blame to any emergency services or ambulance crew member. The blame laid solely with CN Rail and Transport Canada and, you know, all others that play into all of this hiding of the issue so that they never get addressed, that Transport Canada is not doing its job of protecting rail workers, the police isn't doing its job, and on and on and on. So again, this is what proves another lie in that Transportation Safety Board report. Now, folks, you've probably noticed here, I added this last section, these last two slides on TS15 as common parlance at the very end, after I had actually completed the presentation. And I noticed here that my good eye, which is my right eye, the left eye, I'm basically completely blind in. My right eye is my good eye, but I've noticed that it was all bloodshot here. And when I get stressed or I do too much computer time, I tend to pop my veins, or my blood vessels tend to be impacted by that. And so if I see blood in my eye, that's because of the stress. And folks, you know, when I go through all of this, it's been so stressful, not only for the family of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, his parents that I had to drag through a living nightmare for years as I explained to them all of the lies pertaining to their son's death, but also this has been very hard on my family personally because I literally almost went blind in both eyes. And I was able to recover vision in one eye, but it's still an issue, as you can tell, because if I'm on the computer for 8 hours a day, which it takes a lot of time to put these presentations together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start doing some presentations where I don't have to be on the computer, where we can just have a chat about some serious issues that I don't need to present materials for or a lot of materials for, and I can just talk to you guys via the camera. But I apologize for the the issue with my eyes, but it's something beyond my control. I'm gonna have to take it a little more slowly as far as doing the presentation materials. But anyways, just wanted to explain what you're seeing here. If it's bothering you, I'm really sorry about that, but I have to provide these materials, while I still have some vision, in order to help protect all frontline rail workers. So, okay, now we're going to get into the witness statement for the on-the-job trainer. And if you recall, in my previous videos, I was showing you how the Transportation Safety Board made up its own definition of an on-the-job trainer, and, to provide us with their story du jour. And remember, the Transport Canada people and the rail carrier also approved this accident report. And so they were in complete agreement with this made-to-fit definition and how the report was written, so that the on-the-job trainer and the conductor were used almost interchangeably, as if they were one person in this accident report, when in fact they are two very, very different people. And that's further, evidenced by the fact that we have two different witness statements. We have one for the supervising conductor and then one for the on-the-job trainer, or the OJT as they were known at the time. So this on-the-job trainer interview is 6 pages long. And they gave me a copy which was pretty blurry because I don't think they wanted me to be able to read it quite well. But it's you could see here at the top where it says best available copy. There's all kinds of tricks that they use when they don't want you to put things together. But if you look at the date here, and I had to blow it up because when I do the screen print to show you the page number, the reference number for what I was given via the access to information request, I want to provide you with the page number, but you can barely see the date. So I blew it up on the right side here. And you can clearly see that the date was not November 19th of 2013, the day after Jason died. Oh no, this witness statement for a guy who was never at the scene on the day of the accident was taken on June 19th, 2014. Well, folks, this witness statement is taken 214 days after conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. Why the long delay? When there's an accident or a death, you're supposed to have your witness statements right away. Why did it take 7 months for this witness statement to be taken? Well, I suspect, folks, that's because we were collating that railway investigation report and we had to come up with our story du jour and how are we going to protect the rail carrier. And so, it's all in how you define things, how we do the switcheroos to make it look like the conductor and the on-the-job trainer are one and the same when they really are not. And so, explain to me why in police work or anything you would wait 214 days to take this witness statement. This is not a guy who would have been traumatized by the accident. He wasn't even on the scene. So that's not the answer. Why did it take this long to take this witness statement supposedly pertaining to this accident? Okay, so when I said previously that obviously the Transportation Safety Board in its reports, in my opinion, is very much trying to protect the rail carriers, they're also, in my opinion, very much trying to protect Transport Canada. Because if Transport Canada hasn't done its job in potentially decades, in my opinion, um, you know, you would want to be protecting Transport Canada and the government of Canada from all these liabilities also, right? So the arrow I added here, the large arrow, points down to Tyrone Kowalski. That's the name of the person who supposedly took all these witness statements. Tyrone Kowalski was not a Transportation Safety Board employee. He was an employee of Transport Canada. He was the health and safety officer who investigated the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and he came up with his own 80-page report, which I also have, and I'm going to be going through the highlights of that report with you also, because there are a lot of issues with that report too. So, and Tyrone Kowalski would end up leaving Transport Canada. I had tried to reach him as a health and safety officer. And the thing is, folks, when you get these Transportation Safety Board reports and these death investigations, and then you've got to literally fight to get the information, it takes years, literally, to get a lot of this information. And a lot of it they still don't want to release. So, there's that whole issue too. So even though Jason died in 2013, it was in 2019 that I'm fighting to get this information. I only started investigating his death in 2018. So because of another death that had happened in the rail industry is when I started investigating Jason's death. And his report came out about a year after he died. The other employee whose death I was looking at, that one took, I think, 2.5 years for it to come out. And so these reports take a very, very long time to be released by the Transportation Safety Board and reports by Transport Canada and stuff. And then you have to fight to get the information. So it literally can take, 5, 6, 7 years to get this information. From the time it's first collated to the time you can actually get it from the government of Canada. So it's a very grueling process. And to have to go through all those hours online and fighting for this information. I mean, I basically ruined my vision investigating the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney because I was spending up to 16 hours a day on the computer. And so I was going blind, and I had, I think, 4 cornea transplant attempts, a partial cornea transplant in my left eye, but I'm still legally blind in that eye. And I had 1 cornea transplant in this eye. That one took. So I have 1 eye, and that's why, sometimes when I'm reading, I might go out of the screen a little bit to have to get closer to the screen. You're just going to have to put up with that. There's a reason. I mean, my eyes are bad. So, or at least the one. The other one's is pretty good now. But anyway, so Tyrone Kowalski, he worked for Transport Canada, not for the Transportation Safety Board. And so, but again, the Transportation Safety Board and Transport Canada work very closely together. And so it would make sense, if Transport Canada, and the Transportation Safety Board has to see that Transport Canada really hasn't been doing its job for years. And so because they're both arms of the government of Canada, we have to try and protect the government of Canada from liability. And so we work together in cahoots. Conspiracy to hide crimes is criminal. Breach of public trust is criminal. Misappropriation of public funds to garbage investigation reports, garbage hearings, all of this stuff, it takes years. That's all criminal, folks. So there's a lot of people that, again, do not want this information to get out. But unfortunately for them, it's going out to a lot higher than what they could ever have imagined, because these issues now impact also the U.S., because Transport Canada not only failed to do its job, it allowed rail executives, in my humble opinion, that belonged in jail to escape liability. And so, hide a crime, you become a partner in that crime, right? So there's a lot of issues here for Transport Canada and for the government of Canada. So anyways, just wanted to point out Tyrone Kowalski was an employee of Transport Canada, not of the Transportation Safety Board. Okay, so again on the OJT trainer witness statement, which was taken over 200 days after Jason's death, I wanted to show you here. Question 31. It states, with respect to Jason Clooney, to what extent had he received opportunities for training in both yard tours and road tours? And the answer from the OJT, or the on-the-job trainer, and again, this is a different person than the supervising conductor, the answer was he only had opportunity to do road training, but he had exceeded the minimum amount of road tours and was ready for yard training. So, conductor trainee Jason Clooney, per the OJT witness statement, had 0 yard training. So again, if, and that's an if, according to other people who would have known of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, such as this one person that I personally knew, who was at the time a newly qualified conductor for CN, if the word was, as he had stated to me, that the word was conductor trainee Jason Clooney was being qualified the day he was killed, why would he have been qualified if he had 0 yard training? And, you know, the other thing is also, why did the Transportation Safety Board try to imply that Jason had at least some yard training, given the statement saying the conductor trainee had limited yard experience on page 1 of their railway investigation report known as R13W0260? Why the need for this deception? So why not just say he had 0 yard training? So was that to set up the hearing decision in 2016 OHS TC 20, which was the decision and the hearing pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, which happened in 2016 under the Trudeau administration, and that would have been in front of the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada. And so when you look at that decision, and that decision, folks, in my opinion, made the rail worker environment exponentially more dangerous because of what was done in that decision. And there is no way that that decision would have happened had certain information not been held back. And it's not that the parties in that hearing didn't know that information, it's that it was held back in the report pertaining to that hearing, held back from the public and from rail families. So again, massive deceptions, and we're going to get into all of that also. And that was done under the Trudeau administration. And the Trudeau administration, by the time that particular hearing was done, I had already sent them emails on, issues with fake qualifications in the rail industry in June of 2016. And that report would come out in late November of 2016. And so why would you not have been extremely careful as to what was going on in that report for this conductor trainee in that hearing? Well, folks, in my opinion, that hearing had been determined as to its outcome before one word was even heard. And we're going to get into all of that. So basically a fixed judicial hearing in front of an arbitrator, whatever. The outcome, in my opinion, had already been fixed and predetermined before a single word was heard. And I'm going to show you why that is in upcoming videos. Okay, so more on the OJT, or the on-the-job trainer witness statement, which was taken over 200 days after Jason's death. And again, this is not the actual on-the-job trainer. The on-the-job trainer is the supervising conductor. The OJT, um, he basically says in his witness statement that he was basically not trained or whatever as far as conductor trainees. But I just picked out a couple of statements here out of his witness statement. And again, this guy was not part of the crew. He was not on the scene that day. So why the witness statement, especially given statements like this? If you look at question 33 here, it says, specifically in regard to conductor trainee Jason Clooney, in your role as OJT, how often did you meet with him to discuss his performance? And the answer is no specific number of times I can recall. I did encounter him in the terminal, and then I can't really make out this part here, per something, and while working as a locomotive engineer. So doesn't exactly sound like this guy was his supervising trainer, if he would just encounter him in the terminal, you know. So again, all part of the deception, folks, and the brainwashing that goes on in these investigation reports, these garbage investigation reports, paid for by taxpayers. Okay, so what exactly is an on-the-job trainer? That's a good question. They're known as an OJT, and you know, I heard that recently they got rid of OJTs at CN Rail. Um, I don't know. Was it a position created for somebody who was on disability or something? Just to give them a job while they recovered? I have no idea. I just know that these guys were not actual trainers in the field. That would have been the supervising conductor. The fact that this guy said he would see Jason when he was a locomotive engineer only further solidifies that he was not Jason's trainer, because locomotive engineers do not train conductor trainees. Supervising conductors train conductor trainees. Locomotive engineers train new locomotive engineer trainees. They don't train conductors. So again, the whole thing is so fishy. You know what? It's all for the story du jour in those reports that were paid for by taxpayers, and which are, in my opinion, nothing but a rag of lies. And that, I would say, is true for not only the Transportation Safety Board report, but also for the Health and Safety Officer report, which was 80 pages long, and also for the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearing report. And there's a whole lot of other stuff. But anyways, we're going to get into all of that. So here we go. If you look at CTC Rail 3, which again is the law known as also as SOR. CTC is Canadian Transportation Commission. Rail 3 was the month that this law went into effect in 1987. So it says SOR 87-150. That's another name for it. It's known as the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. That's the key word. This is a regulation enforceable in court. So if you look at the on-the-job training instructor definition, according to this regulation, that means an employee or officer of a railway company who is qualified under these regulations to instruct employees. So, keywords, regulation, and to instruct employees. Whereas the made to fit definition found in Jason's accident report in a footnote on page 11, footnote number 14, there an on-the-job trainer is defined as an experienced employee who is designated by the company to provide assignments and trainers for a trainee. They don't provide the training. They provide assignments and trainers. They don't do the training. So this made to fit definition by the Transportation Safety Board, and we could argue by Transport Canada and the rail carrier, because they signed off on the accuracy of this report in the interest of rail safety, this made-to-fit definition is nothing but garbage, in my opinion, and it most certainly does not override the actual definition of an on-the-job instructor as provided in the regulation. And this on-the-job instructor definition, as provided in the regulation, speaks about instructing employees. So that would be a qualified conductor acting as a supervising conductor for a conductor trainee, not this garbage definition that we're given in Jason's accident report. So the brainwashing techniques, folks, they're numerous, they're extremely deceptive, and they take years to unravel. You almost have to be a lawyer to figure this out. I'm very good at technical writing, and I worked with lawyers in the past, but it still took years to figure out a lot of this stuff. So anyways, just be aware of that. There are many techniques, lots of deceptions, lots of lies. Okay, so as I conclude this particular video on the brainwashing and what's not provided and hidden from taxpayers and all those rail families, I want to leave you with a quotable quote. It says, "Bend the rules, you will be punished. Break the law, you will be charged. Abuse the public trust, you will go to prison." That quote is from Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister of Canada when the garbage investigation report from the Transportation Safety Board pertaining to Jason's death was written. And the garbage and the turning of a blind eye to so many violations of so many laws would most definitely very much continue under the Prime Minister Trudeau administration, as clearly seen via 2016 OHS TC 20. Which is the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal decision pertaining to Jason's death. In my opinion, a prearranged or fixed tribunal decision before one word was even heard. And we're going to get into all of that too. So stay tuned. And on that, have a great day. Okay, so this concludes part 7 in the series on brainwashing in TSB investigation reports, such as that pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and make sure you remain subscribed. And I will see you in part 8. So have a great day.